Welcome to the Massachusetts General Hospital Frontotemporal Disorders Unit Community Forum Friday webinar series. My name is Katie Brandt. I'm the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today, our session is Intersection of Care and Innovation, Research Connections, a spotlight on the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging. Many of you know that for the Community Forum Friday webinar series, I like to draw in experts from our community to help families navigate care planning, connections with resources, and learning vital information to help with the journey of a life lived with a dementia diagnosis. For our Winter 2022 series, I wanted to focus on resources, programs, and supports available in the larger Massachusetts General Hospital community and system. The Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging is an incredible center and partner in our ventures for research. You know that our FTD unit is a clinical research program dedicated to providing the highest quality of care and also working tirelessly towards a cure for Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and related disorders. We could not work towards that goal of treatment and a cure without other partners in the scientific innovation space. And the Martino Center, with their emphasis on imaging, brain imaging especially, for our patients and research participants, make them a critical partner. I always say to families, I'm so sorry that you need us, but I'm glad that you found us. Because I want our families to know when you're connected with our program, you are connected with opportunities to participate in research that's connected to the global community of scientists who've dedicated their professional lives to figuring out, trying to understand the secrets of these diseases, come up with treatments to slow and stop the progression, and also to prevent them from ever occurring. Many of you know that I've been involved in policy work where that's my dream, to figure out how can we raise more awareness, funds, and hope to support the amazing innovation required to get these treatments and prevention off the ground so that the families of tomorrow won't experience what many families are facing today. So I will be spotlighting the amazing Martino Center. We'll start with an interview with Dr. Bruce Rosen. He is the director of the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging at Massachusetts General Hospital and a professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School. We'll also have Dr. David Salat, who's a neuroscientist and a research investigator, helping us to understand. He'll walk us through brain images and talk about the power that they have. I'll talk about the Martino Center in general. For those of you who walk in the doors, maybe you think, oh, I'm just on the first floor of my research appointment for the FTD unit. It's actually this incredible hub of innovation. And we want you to know about it. We want you to know about all of the amazing behind the scenes work that goes on to get you to the moment where you're laying in a scanner and contributing a brain image to one of our essential studies. So I hope that you'll enjoy this program today. I hope that you'll be interested to learn more about the resources and partnerships. And I hope what you'll take away from this session is that you are a part of the cure of tomorrow. We're incredibly grateful for your time and attention, not only for the session, for the work that we do, but also for everything that you've given to make the research possible. Thank you. Hi, Bruce. Welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
So I just would love to introduce you today. Dr. Bruce Rosen is director of the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging at Massachusetts General Hospital and professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Rosen, thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Oh, it's great fun. Thanks very much.
So I think that, right off the bat, people are probably wondering, why is Katie interviewing the director of the Martino Center? What does that have to with research in the FTD unit? And I was hoping that maybe you could just start by explaining what is the connection with the Martino Center and Mass General Hospital, Martinos and our research community, maybe just a little overview.
Well, maybe a place to start is what is the Martino Center and what do we do within our universe? And I think that'll help answer the question. It's maybe even worth starting with our full name. We don't always use it to try to shorten things up, but our formal name is the Athenula A. Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging. So who is Athenula? Athenula was a young woman, a student at MIT, the daughter of a Greek shipping family, who very sadly committed suicide following a mental illness. She probably had undiagnosed schizophrenia. And in trying to come to terms with the grief of losing a child, nothing, of course, is more soulfully felt than that, the family was interested in developing a program that would help scientists and clinicians actually be able to understand what's happening in the brain of people with mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia, but all the different illnesses of the brain, everything from stroke and brain tumors to mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression, and of course, dementias, a very important part. So they very generously gave a gift to start the Athenula Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging, because they were convinced that being able to actually look into the brains of our patients, and of course, to be able to understand how even normal brains work using the tools of modern brain imaging would help us understand the normal brain, help us understand how the brain doesn't work, where it goes wrong, would help us evaluate new treatments for the brain more rapidly to be able to actually see whether the brains are changing in the ways that they would need to change in order to get better, and ultimately help develop the ability to help more patients by being able to diagnose sooner, evaluate treatments, and make sure those treatments were directed to the right patients. And so the Martino Center set out with this mission to develop the tools and then to apply the tools. This kind of joint mission, build new tools, and then let's think about how we could use them ultimately to help our patients.
I mean, what a beautiful example of how philanthropy can be healing and establish a legacy to really say, I don't want another family to experience what we've experienced. And yeah, I know that our program has benefited from philanthropy, but it's so moving to hear you tell that story about the origin story of the center.
It could never have happened without that philanthropic gift, that catalyst, because that was the gift that allowed all these different groups, the physicists, the engineers, the computer scientists, and the psychiatrists and neurologists, the radiologists, all to come together in one place, in one building, to work together and to take on problems that are at the earliest stages. We're very fortunate living here in the United States, where we have things like the NIH, which provides a lot of money for research, and that's incredibly valuable. But at the earliest stages, the government really only funds work that's more mature, more established. It's a very conservative body. If we want to explore new ideas, develop new tools, or test those tools in conditions or in ways that we've never done before, the NIH will say, well, do the experiment first, and then come back to us and ask for money. Well, where are we going to get the resources to do that first experiment, to build that first camera, or put the first set of patients in? That's where philanthropy is so important. For us, it was vital with the Martino Center. When we started, we were a tiny little group. Now We're a much larger group. A lot of that funding, of course, comes in from the government, but it never would have happened without that spark that the Martinez Center gave us. And I know in your program, you depend on philanthropy for exactly that same thing. And it's so important. I agree.
Well, and you just use that word spark. I think about
that's our little spark.
That's your spark on your logo.
That's right. That's exactly what it's supposed to be. That's right.
It's also, I've had the pleasure of being able to tour the Martino Center and able to see the creative minds at work. I've joked that your team, they sometimes approach like a new MRI scanner as maybe another person might approach a lawnmower, that they want to take apart and see how it's working, and just that approach of fearlessness with this incredible technology that paves the way to innovation.
Although I will say, I'm much more afraid of a lawnmower than I am of our MRI systems. And I would much rather have an MRI scan than have to go out and mow the lawn.
Okay, well.
Much easier and much, much safer. No spinning blades in our MR scanners. Very, very safe, very relaxing, a little noisy, though not nearly as noisy as a lawnmower. It's a great analogy by comparison.
That's really funny. So that's a great segue. I think that families are really curious about, number one, what are the types of scans that someone who's participating in an Alzheimer's disease or related dementia research study might get? And then I think they have questions about, are there risks associated with getting those scans?
Very important questions and legitimate questions. I won't deny that when you see these big machines, a big magnet or a PET scanner, they can seem pretty intimidating. And so, in that regard, I didn't mean to make light of the fact that, it's serious business for sure. However, in fact, all of the tools that we use, and I'll go through them, really are very safe. So let's go through them. So we do a lot of MRI. I talked about that. And that's probably the technology that more of your, patients and their families are aware of. Of course, we do MRI scans to study patients with their brains, but we do them if they twist a knee or have low back pain. There's a lot of reasons we use MR. It's a very, very common test. And the scanners that we use at the Martino Center are very much like the scanners that you would go into if you sprained your ankle or twisted your knee or had low back pain, any of those conditions. Many of them are the same. I will admit we tend to supercharge them a little bit at the Martino Center. We like to kind of push those limits, but from the standpoint of the patient and their families, you would look at them, they would look identical. Patient table, a magnet, you kind of slowly get put in it, very much the same. The MRI systems themselves are very, very safe. They don't use any x-rays. We don't typically inject anything into people. There are some risks associated with an MRI scan only if people are not careful and were to bring some metal into the room. And so we're extremely careful. You'll see there are metal detectors at the door, and all of our technologists always pat themselves down reflexively when they go in. And of course, we do thousands and thousands of MR scans across our entire health system a year. I've never heard a patient in that way. So MR is a wonderful tool. It's probably our most commonly used tool because it's so powerful and the images are so compelling. The only issue we hear, because the magnet tends to be a somewhat longer tube, some people feel it's a little claustrophobic. And so we have to work with patients so that they're aware of what they're going. We can give them things so that they have goggles so that they can see out and actually see visual things or hear music while they're in the scanners, just like the clinical scanners do. Basically take people's minds off of, that claustrophobic environment. For me, when I go in the scanner, I fall asleep immediately. I find it very relaxing. Your mileage may vary. People are different, but it's certainly It's a very safe and very common procedure, and really no different from if you had an MR scan for almost any other purpose. We're very fortunate at the Martinez Center, though, to have some additional tools that we use, which give us somewhat different looks at the brain. For example, we have one tool with a very long name, magnetoencephalography, but we usually just initialize it MEG or MEG. That's a tool that allows us to look at electrical activity in the brain, a lot like an EEG, which is something that maybe your patients or their families are more familiar with, but with even more detail that can see the electrical activity with greater clarity and resolution than just an EEG machine does. Actually, the Mass General is the only clinical MEG machine in all of New England. We use it in patients, for example, with epilepsy, where it can identify the epileptic seizures much more precisely than EEG can and other tools. But we also have used it for some of our dementia studies because of its ability to see how the brain coordinates activity literally millisecond by millisecond. MR is a great tool, but not as fast. It takes seconds to take our pictures. EEG and MEG together take our pictures in milliseconds, in thousandths of a second. And so can literally watch thoughts as they're passing from one part of the brain to the other in real time. It's really quite remarkable. And so it's very useful as we try to understand how dementia can impact our ability to coordinate different parts of our brain into these coherent functions of memory and cognition, recognition, speech. These all require not one part of the brain, but different parts of the brain across the entire brain to work together and for information to pass from one part to the other, all very, very quickly. And so watching that process is something that's a unique province of MEG technology. And so we use that. Another tool that we use very commonly is PET imaging, positron emission tomography is its full name. We call it PET, P-E-T. PET is also unique because it teaches us about the chemistry of the brain. Many of your patients may be aware of the buildup of things like amyloid and tau in the brain. They may have heard about these proteins. PET is the way we can directly image them. MR is a great tool, but doesn't see them. MEG sees the electrical activity, but doesn't see these proteins and how they're building up and where they're building up. We can do blood tests that can see some element of them, and many of your patients may have had those blood tests, those blood biomarkers, but they can't tell us where they're building up, and they can't tell us how much is building up in the different parts of the brain. That's what PET can do uniquely. Again, PET is it's friendly. Actually, we have somewhat unique PET devices. Many elements of the Martinez Center are unique because our PET scanners are actually inside MR scanners because the two of them work beautifully together. The MR scan gives us this exquisite anatomy, these beautiful pictures of the structure of the brain, and then we can overlay exactly where the molecular changes, where these chemical changes are occurring in the brain. And we can do it all in one scan. So we don't have to take an MR scan and then move the patient into a separate PET scan. We can do it all together. It's not terrible if we do them separately, but it's kind of a convenience, and there's certain advantages to doing them all together. So we use all of those tools to try to understand the big picture of what's happening in patients with dementias of all kinds. Are there changes in blood flow that we want to look at? We can do that with MR. Are there changes in the molecular pathways? We can do that with PET. Is the way the brain is orchestrating its coordinated function, is that what's going awry? MEG tells us that. So we can really use all of these tools to try to get a comprehensive view of what's happening in the diseases in general, and we hope ultimately what's happening in individual subjects so we can really target the appropriate treatments for those patients. And this is what we're doing the research to try to understand so that in the future, when a patient comes to us, we'll be able to tell them precisely what the problem is, and then hopefully precisely what the best treatment is to treat that problem.
I just want to say, first of all, Dr. Rosen, you are a passionate educator about this. I can hear, even the way you describe the images and their beauty, that this is not just
much. It's
No,
so sweet to put it the way you did.
this is not just work for you. This is a passion.
That's for sure. No, I'm. It's the lucky man or woman, of course. I think you probably share this with me, that gets to do what they want and get paid a little bit for it. And I'm very, very, very fortunate to be able to do this. This, for a guy like me, I love the technology. As a young boy, I built my own telescope in the backyard, and I was a ham radio operator, and I just loved building things. But of course, then I trained in medicine, and of course, was fascinated by the brain and learning about the conditions of the brain, and the ability to bring both together, to apply the technology to understand the most complex machine there is, the human brain, and then of course to even go further to try to direct that understanding to helping people. Like, what's better than that? Nothing.
It's so amazing too to hear you talk about the idea of precision medicine, your own unique brain image, and how targeted we can make treatment one day when we know exactly where people are suffering and why they're suffering.
Absolutely. It's a big part of the work of your clinic. I know that. And of course, we're very happy to work, with Dr. Dickerson and the rest of the team there on their projects, and many other physicians and scientists throughout the center are all, interested in exactly understanding what's specific about each patient. We know their genetics is different, what their experiences are different, and how their brain reacts to those experiences are different. So to think that there's going to be one magic bullet that's going to solve the problem of dementia, I don't think we're going to be that lucky. I think it's going to require us to really understand in each individual patient what their problems are, and then target the treatments towards that. And we're making great strides in that direction.
Well, that was going to be my final question for you today. What is it about the work that is being done at Martinos that gives you hope for one day effective treatments, a cure, hopefully prevention of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias?
Yeah, what a fabulous question. And of course, I wish we were already at that prevention, point. But of course, the key to prevention is being able to understand what is it that causes this kind of cascade of events that ultimately leads to patients and their inability to, function in their daily lives. But we know, in large measure, from the kind of studies that colleagues like Dr. Dickerson and others have been doing over the last 20 years, that these changes begin in the brain not just a few years before, but decades before. The molecular changes, the buildup of these abnormal proteins, the inability for certain brain networks to function together, the abnormalities in electrical activity, all of these things we now know occur a decade or even 2 decades before patients lose their function. And so one of the keys to prevention is to be able to identify who are the patients that are most at risk, who are the patients that are beginning to suffer from the earliest changes, but before there's any degree of brain loss and cognitive decline, so that we can intervene. And of course, what's the specific nature of that pathology? We know, for example, some patients have a very significant vascular component to their dementia. Their blood vessels aren't working well, the same way people develop heart disease. But just like with heart disease, you don't want to wait till somebody has a heart attack. You want to measure their blood pressure and evaluate them and intervene early. We believe the same is going to be true in the brain, but in the brain, it's a little harder. We can't just take their blood pressure and know what's going on in the blood vessels in the brain. But we can do these imaging studies that we're doing with MR and with PET to actually see the changes early. And then, of course, we're now learning a lot about how to prevent, slow down, and ultimately prevent the accumulation of vascular pathology. We've learned a lot from the heart that we can apply to the brain, but we need to know who to apply it to. And that's where our tools can be so useful. Similarly, for the changes in these proteins like amyloid and tau, we've now learned not only do they develop early, but we've used our tools to actually show that we can develop treatments that can begin to remove them. And of course, I know all of your patients are well aware of the first drug that was approved. I think the first of many that are to come. We know that they can remove the amyloid, but is that the whole story? Can we start even earlier in those patients? Will they be more effective the earlier we apply them? Are there other compounds that we'll need to do at the same time? Do we also at the same time need to look after their vascular health, or perhaps address other biological problems that also we know contribute? I suspect the answer is likely to be yes if we're really to be effective at these early preventions. And so again, the things that we're learning about the detailed mechanisms and biology of how these diseases evolve will directly translate to how we can develop new treatments, and even more important, just as you say, how we can prevent the disease from ever happening, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Let's start preventing these things, but that means we really got to wind back the clock. And I'd like to think that the tools we're developing, are going to be a part of it. Not the whole part, of course, but I hope a very useful part.
Well, and what an endorsement as well for participation in research studies, because you can be an incredible scientist, you can have all the right technology, but if you don't have research participants, how can you conduct the studies that you need to help to bring more information to increase our knowledge?
Katie, this is such an important point. I mean, we know medical research advances with a lot of tools, with things in test tubes, with animal models and mice, but there is no substitute for the human condition and the human disease. We don't have anything that really replicates the full constellation of conditions, genetic changes, environmental experiences, life experiences that impact on patients. The only way to understand that is to study patients, study people. And of course, the work that you're doing to help bring families, not only the patients, but the rest of the families to bear, to help us with this process. It is a partnership. We cannot do it, no matter how much philanthropic money we get, or how much money the government gives us, and how brilliant our scientists are. And all of those are in play. We can't do it without the partnership with our patients. That's what we depend on to make progress. And so thank you for, and all of the people that you're representing here, for making that happen.
Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Rosen. The passion and the information that you provided today, I hope will inspire one of our listeners, if they're not already engaged in research, to reach out and say, I'd like to learn more. I'm interested to find out, what studies am I eligible for? How can I contribute?
Please do. For all of you that may be watching or listening, we very much welcome your involvement. We'll take very good care of you, and I can assure you that what you'll contribute will help people in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Rosen. I know we'll be in touch again soon.
I'll look forward to it.
I'm David Vaughn. I'm the Executive Director of the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging at Mass General Hospital. The amount of creativity that has come out of the center is something kind of really that fits well with me, and I enjoy thriving in environments like that. When you're around such influential people, I think it kind of forces you to be influential and inspiring too. So it always pushes yourself to think outside of the box, because they're doing it from a scientific standpoint. So you're like, oh, well, maybe I can be creative from an administrative and operations standpoint as well. Mass General Hospital, growing up, we've always referred to it as man's greatest hospital, and you want it to reflect the population that you are actually serving. So right now, I've been partnering very closely. We have this Women in Science group within our organization, and they've become not only a group that's promoting women in the sciences, but underrepresented minorities in the environment. Right now, we have 20 students that are from the community, that are high school students, that are actually working in labs this summer right now, learning about what bench science is, what research is, what NIH grants are, and who really has that opportunity in high school age to find out more about that and be surrounded by these world-renowned researchers who are cutting edge. And I think just promoting more opportunities like that is something that is really important to me. The Martino Center loves to be at the forefront of cutting edge technology, and the Martino Center is always looking to build and create and invent new technologies. So we're always looking for the next best thing, where we're gonna position ourselves, how we can grow. And some of our faculty too have, even created their own startup companies as offshoots of some of these inventions, so they can continue growing them outside of the MGH scope and realm.
I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. David Salat, a neuroscientist and investigator from the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging and the VA Hospital. Dr. Salat is also a member of the Department of Radiology at Mass General Hospital. And he's here today to talk with us about the amazing imaging work that's happening at the Martino Center, the work that he's involved in, to help us understand a little bit more about how imaging supports not only clinical care, but advancements in knowledge and understanding of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and related disorders, and how we hope that imaging will play a role as we move forward towards treatment and a cure. Dr. Salat, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
Is there anything additional that you would like to say about your work as I'm welcoming you to the program, just as a way of letting folks know, how you're connected with the research in Alzheimer's and related dementias?
Sure. I think that, in our research, we use brain imaging, as we'll discuss in a bit, but the main idea is that we can use these tools to study all sorts of ways that the brain may be affected by a whole range of lifestyle, health, and other factors that a person experiences throughout the entire lifespan. And I think, we tend to use these procedures as an endpoint to understand disease. But, through the sorts of research that we do, we can also understand factors that, influence an individual's brain and their brain health throughout life as well.
Yeah, and that's so important. And I think, part of having you as an integral part of the session today was to really talk about all the different ways that we're using images, especially because we know for some research participants, imaging can be a little uncomfortable. Maybe the experience of getting the image taken. And so we really want folks to understand why it's so important and why we're especially thankful and appreciative that they're willing to go through that experience.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We often are asking people to come to our studies and spend an hour and a half or longer, laying inside a dark tube. And, it might not always be clear why somebody might be in the scanner for that long, and how important it is and how much useful information we get when they are willing to do that and generously give their time for those sorts of studies.
Yes. So I'd love to invite you to share your slides. I know you prepared a few slides for us today, and we thought as we were preparing for this session that it might be helpful if we looked at them together. Many people know that in my role as the Director of Caregiver Support Services, I'm not a scientist or a physician. And in fact, I do have experience as a family caregiver. So hopefully I'll be able to ask some questions that might come to mind for family caregivers.
Great, sure. I'll bring them up now. Essentially, the slides are really around kind of this idea of explaining at least a bit as to how participation in research, particularly in our case, brain imaging, which is a primary technique that we use in our studies, really contributes to knowledge and medical advances.
Yeah, that's, I think, the main message that we want everyone to take home today.
And so just as an important point, this might be obvious, but it's important to ask the question, when someone goes to their doctor and they get some images taken, where did that imaging actually come from? We might think that the technology in the world is just so advanced that we can just create a new device and it's going to give us the information that we need immediately. However, this technology really is based on a lot of research, and it's typically years or decades of research that get us to the point where an actual device can actually be used to understand an individual's health. And that includes the technology used to develop, that's developed to take the pictures inside the body, for example, the scanners that are used. It's the information that the doctor learns to look for in the scans that tell them what an individual's health is, as well as to use those sorts of technologies in terms of trying to understand if treatment is successful.
Something I think about a lot is for the patients that we care for in the FTD unit, the road to diagnosis can be difficult. And could you talk a little bit about why is it that every radiologist might not be able to read an image the same way?
Yeah, so I'm in a radiology department, but I'm not a radiologist. So just make that caveat, before I speak to this. But it's really challenging to to look at a scan and understand what exactly is going on. So, for example, when you're talking about diseases of aging that are more typical in older adults, there's typically a number of things that may be going on inside that individual or in that individual's brain that might make the interpretation of the image challenging. And there are some common signs that, of course, radiologists look for very very clear conditions, such as a tumor. But when you get to conditions like neurodegenerative conditions, that can be a little bit more murky, particularly in the earlier stages of the disease. And so, having good, high quality imaging can be very important in those diagnostic decisions. Do contribute to a variety of aspects of imaging development. For example, they develop imaging devices, scanners, that are used to measure different properties from the brain. There are investigators at the Martino Center that are working on computer programs to image different properties of the brain, which I'll talk a little bit about. There, as well as to quantify those properties, to extract numbers about the health of the brain that can be used, specifically for diagnostic or prognostic purposes, being able to track how a disease is progressing. And then these procedures that get developed for imaging can then be used to better understand the disease. And by better understanding, the biological causes of the disease, that information can be used to then generate new ideas about treatments that could be used to help against the disease processes.
These images are incredibly striking. You know, they're beautiful, almost look artistic, but I know that the colors have scientific meaning. Could you talk a little bit about that? And are these all the same type of image?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, you know, what we do is, as researchers, is we take the type of image that people are probably used to seeing from, say, a scanner like an MRI scanner, something that shows, the brain in detail, and then what we can do with those images is really use sophisticated computer processing procedures to create these different types of models of the brain. So in this case, in the top left, you're looking at what's referred to as a structural model of the brain. And all of these different colored labels basically are different parts of the brain. And what we can do with those different labels now, is extract different types of measurements from those labels. We can ask, for example, if these different parts of the brain may be shrinking, for example, due to a disease process. We can ask if the activity in those parts of the brain, the way that the brain cells are communicating and working, may be impacted by, for example, a disease. On the top right, you're looking at an image that shows the connections of the brain. So basically the structural connections of the brain. These two images, the model that you see on the top left and the model that you see on the top right, were created by different types of images. So again, going back to the question, why might we be in the scanner for an hour and a half to collect these images? It's because the different types of images provide us with different types of information. The type of scan that is necessary for creating these structural models is different than the type of scan that's necessary for creating, for example, these connection models. And then on the bottom here, what you see is another type of scan that measures the what we interpret as the communication of different parts of the brain. So, for example, these yellow regions are parts of the brain that are showing synchronized activity. So they're basically going, their activity is going up together and is going down together, and that's interpreted by scientists as basically communication or co-utilization of brain regions to perform some type of cognitive or thinking operation. But essentially, it gives us a measure of the activity of the brain. And again, this image, to create this image is, this measure of communication comes from a different type of image than the other two above here. So when somebody's in the scanner and you hear, for example, all those different sounds, that's really, those sounds come from some really intelligent people that have figured out ways of probing these different aspects of the brain structure, brain connectivity, brain function. And those different beeps and sounds are essentially, an individual collecting, the researcher is collecting different types of information that can be used to get at these different properties of brain.
It's really incredible to think about structure, connectivity, and also activity, right? And to think about for our families, the more that they can understand, they could see in an image like, Dr. Dickerson, I've seen him say, there's some space here where there normally would be beautiful fat brain tissue, right? But for families, I think to really understand, okay, so the structure looks different. How does it impact the functioning? And that may very well impact care planning or their understanding of how the disease might progress. And I think it just also speaks to the complexity of the brain, that you could never get all the information about it from one type of image.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, these are only a very small subset of the types of images that we can acquire, using our different imaging techniques. The complexity is really challenging, and understanding, for example, how changes in the structure in a particular part of the brain might contribute to a loss of the communication between two parts of the brain is the sort of thing that we do in our research, or understanding how, for example, these connections, when these connections are affected, how that might, which they might be affected by different disease processes, how that might result in, an individual having worse symptoms than they might have if those connections were intact. That's all, the type of information that we can get from these sorts of studies, and the types of information that could then be used to, both think about, potential new treatments and track how the disease progresses over time. And putting all that information together is very challenging, but it is something that we, try to do.
And when you think about putting it all together, who are the professionals who might collaborate to, understand these images and their impact for families when we think about the clinical side, right? Like the impact to a family. So who would be the folks who would be a part of a conversation like that?
Yeah, this is a very multidisciplinary type of research, particularly particularly trying to get this research into the clinic, to use the things that we learn from our research for clinical use. That includes, from the start of the process, from the development of the techniques, it includes physicists, it includes engineers, it includes computer scientists, it includes, of course, the physicians that treat the patients and are familiar with the clinical conditions. It includes the basic scientists and biologists and neurobiologists that are familiar with the pathology. We use imaging across radiology and nuclear medicine, and includes, of course, the radiologists and the neuroradiologists that can read these types of scans clinically. It includes statisticians and statistical experts that can put this information together in a meaningful way that combines all of the information in a way that actually gives us some useful understanding of how these different factors come together to influence, to impact the patient and their symptoms, and how their symptoms are expressed, and again, potential treatment options.
I love the way you just described that, because to me, I'm imagining like this entire army, this community of professionals, all getting the scanner ready and waiting for that dyad, that caregiver and patient to show up, because none of this work could happen if you didn't have brains to look at, right? And just really wanting all of our research participants to know the incredible collaborative efforts that have gone into getting this moment ready for them.
I think it's important, for people to know that there's a whole team and a whole institution behind the research that we're doing. None of us could do any of this work in a vacuum, and really through the support of the individuals on our teams, as well as our collaborators and colleagues, as well as our departments and our institution, that we're able to do this work. And it really is a unique environment, at MGH, where we do have such interdisciplinary collaborative work, particularly through, for example, departments of radiology, neurology, psychiatry, and all the various centers, contained within. Just mentioning, this is the sort of typical scan, image that might come off an MRI scanner. So, for example, this is referred to as a FLAIR image, a T2 image, a T1 image, and these are the types of images that are used to create, for example, this computerized model here. And there's a lot of work that goes from getting an image that looks like this to an image that looks like this. And so again, a lot of the sort of work that gets done within the Martino Center. These images down here are showing metabolic activity in the brain. So basically brain energy utilization. And so, just looking at these images, you can see these red areas are where the most energy is being used. And again, in certain conditions, disease conditions, for example, this metabolism or this utilization of energy begins to be reduced. And that's the sort of thing that, might be used clinically to try to diagnose a particular disease. And I already talked about connections and brain function.
So could you say, Dr. Salat, what would be a term that a family member might hear if they were looking at one of these images? Would the physician say to them, this is an MRI image of your loved one's brain, or this is a PET scan? Like how would they describe these to the families that are looking at them?
Sure. Yeah. So these are, there are a number of different types of procedures that we use. So for example, these images on top are from magnetic resonance imaging. That's what what we typically refer to as MRI. These scans are really primarily using water inside tissue to make their images, and you can do a lot with water to get these nice both structural and functional images of the brain. But down here is a different type of imaging procedure that's referred to as positron emission tomography. In positron emission tomography or PET imaging, it's very different from MRI. And PET imaging, we're using a radio-labeled tracer, so we can. So the chemists, who I didn't mention before, another discipline in imaging, the chemists can create molecules that are labeled with with a radioactive molecule that can be used to label different parts of the brain. So, for example, in this case, what you're seeing here is where essentially radio-labeled glucose, which is a primary energy source for the brain, is being taken up. And so these red areas are where the radio-labeled glucose is most prominent and where the most energy is being used. Other types of molecules that one could label and that have been used in research are, for example, what we call neurotransmitters. So we can label certain brain chemical systems, like you may have heard of dopamine as one of those sorts of brain chemicals, and we can use PET imaging to label where dopamine is in the brain. And then another really important use of PET imaging is the ability to label pathology in the brain. So recent developments allow the investigator to look at patterns of certain types of brain pathology. For example, in Alzheimer's disease, we can now see maps of where, for example, amyloid is in the brain and tau is in the brain. And of course, that's also across all other conditions such as FTD as well.
Yeah, I think that for our families, they might hear about, oh, the doctor wants my loved one to have a scan. Well, what kind of scan and what information will we learn? And they might not be sure. I really like how you listed these questions here under each type of imaging to really help think about not only what can families learn to understand more about their loved one's condition, but what can scientists learn from each image to contribute to the growing body of knowledge.
Yeah, I'll say it again. We're very fortunate to have a number of different procedures that provide us with, the brain is a complex organ that has a wide range of biological, physiological properties that can be assessed by imaging. This is just again some of the basic things that we can measure. For example, just simply how big different parts of the brain are. We know, for example, that for a given individual at a given age, their brain should look a certain way. And if we measure, if we can quantitatively measure the size of different parts of the brain, then we can start to see, for example, if an individual is starting to show subtle changes that might be important clinically.
Something that I'm just thinking about looking at these brain images and thinking about the different things you're able to measure, but there's still something so elusive, like when we think about personhood, and especially for our families that have behavioral variant FTD, they might talk about how their loved one's personality seems different. And so there are still these mysteries in the brain that I think you're describing. We can learn so many things from imaging, but not everything yet.
Not everything. And, but the goal really is to understand, again, the specific types of changes that lead to specific types of symptoms. Yeah, so this is, an example that's typically used to show the sort of changes, that occur in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. On the left here, you can see, a typical healthy brain. There's not, we have these folds, but there's not that much space between the folds. Really, we have a very, a brain that essentially fills our skull. Whereas, in the case particularly of advanced Alzheimer's disease, we see that there's a good amount of what we refer to as atrophy throughout the cerebral cortex. The white matter also shrinks. We see this enlargement of the lateral ventricles, which is typically a normal fluid-filled space, cerebrospinal fluid-filled space, but gets much larger in the patients with Alzheimer's disease, as well as a loss of tissue and specific structures that we know are extremely important for memory, such as the hippocampus, which is typically down here. You could see again filling out most of the space in sort of the healthy brain, but significantly reduced in size in a patient with particularly later stage Alzheimer's disease. But really, the sorts of changes that you see here are occurring very much earlier than typically when an individual is diagnosed with the disorder. And so one of the ways that we can use imaging is really to try to detect these sorts of changes, but much earlier in the process, well before the time when the brain has changed so much that you see these profound changes as you do here. And so some of these procedures use automated labeling of different parts of the brain that we know are going to be affected early in patients with Alzheimer's disease, and to use measurements, quantitative measurements from those parts of the brain to try to, in statistical models, to determine whether or not somebody seems like they may be on a trajectory of the type of degeneration that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And so on the left here, again, you can see the typical, type of image that a radiologist might look at and say, clearly this person has degenerative changes in the brain that are consistent with Alzheimer's disease. But on the right, it might be a little bit more challenging. These images might be a little bit more challenging. And so, it is possible to use these more automated, computerized procedures to get diagnostic support to provide the radiologist with additional information about the individual that they might not be able to have by just looking at the image alone. And so this is still in the realm of research, but it is an area where hopefully these sorts of support processes will be pretty common in the future.
I am imagining that one day, Dr. Salat, that there will be early tests that we can take that will let us know of a future risk, and we'll be able to take a treatment that will prevent us from progressing. And I hope that will be something that I'll see within my lifetime. I'm very inspired by the advances in Alzheimer's and related dementia research.
And that's definitely a goal of a number of researchers, applying these sorts of procedures to really, and again, it is a part of how research participation contributes to our understanding and our development of clinical procedures. It may be possible due to these sorts of research studies to identify individuals with disease well before symptoms appear. And then that's going to be really the time when treatments are going to be most effective.
Exactly.
And I'll just briefly mention what you see here on the right, which is a way that we use imaging to try to understand mechanisms of the disease or the biological causes of the disease. So for example, Alzheimer's disease is typically considered a disease of degeneration of the neurons, the brain cells, but less directly related to other conditions that are common in older adults, such as cerebrovascular disease. Cerebrovascular disease or cardiovascular disease, you more typically associate with heart attack or stroke. But what we're finding and what people have been demonstrating for a while now is that the degree of somebody's cardiovascular disease has a big impact on their brain, and that might be before any severe symptoms of cardiovascular disease, but it might impact the course of other conditions such as Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia. So in this case, what you're seeing here, are referred to as T2 weighted MRI scans. And what you could see in this individual on the right is this brightening, these bright spots in the white matter. This is essentially showing damage to the tissue that connects different parts of the brain. So it's really a deterioration of the connections of different parts of the brain. And these bright spots are, for example, increased in people with cardiovascular disease, such as hypertension. And so what we're finding and what various people have described is that when you have these types of changes in the brain, the symptoms that are associated with Alzheimer's disease are worse. So for an individual in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease, an individual who also has cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular risk is likely to have worse symptoms than an individual who doesn't have those conditions. So this tells us a little bit about how just general health, really may have an impact on, these conditions that are so important to understand better, in terms of the brain.
Well, and what a great opportunity to empower our community of research participants, patients, caregivers, family members, that there are things that we can do to increase our brain's cognitive resilience, to make our brains as healthy as possible, so that if Alzheimer's disease or another neurodegenerative condition is present, that it is coming up against the strongest, healthiest brain, to try to stem that disease tide.
So just, I guess a quick summary as to, just a quick summary about why imaging research participation is important based on some of the information I showed previously. We talk about two types of studies in our research, our clinical research. We talk about observational studies and we talk about interventional studies. When we're talking about observational studies are the types of studies where people may come in, go through a day of assessments. They may do some typical health-related assessments, maybe a blood draw to measure certain aspects of health, maybe get their blood pressure taken, maybe report their health history. Typically, we do neuropsychological testing. We might ask them questions about their lifetime health. We might ask them questions about their family and their family's health. And then again, use our advanced sophisticated brain imaging procedures. And what we are able to do with those sorts of observational studies, which is really important, is start to link these different factors to brain health. So for example, as I showed earlier, we can ask what imaging measures can be used to detect the earliest signs of disease, but also what factors such as genetics, what genes might be most related to brain health, what systemic health or other factors outside of the brain might contribute to how healthy the brain is. What sort of lifestyle factors, things like exercise or meditation, might contribute to the likelihood that somebody has a healthy versus an unhealthy brain. And we can only understand that through these large observational studies where we're able to statistically look at the relationships between what people do in their life and how their brains look. And then these observational studies really are fundamental for coming up with ideas for interventional studies. So based on the idea that cardiovascular health is really important for risk for cognitive impairment and dementia, there have been recent clinical trials to look at how certain interventions, such as intensive blood pressure reduction, may result in a reduction in the rate of development of cognitive impairment. And then interventional studies, again, so these are the sorts of studies where somebody does receive a treatment. These sorts of studies can't really be done without the observational studies. The observational studies come first, the interventional studies come second. And then we can ask questions like, how does an intervention, either a standard clinical intervention or a clinical trial where a new drug, for example, is being tested, how does that new drug affect the brain or the pathology that we can measure through the imaging procedures?
That is something that I think is so profound, to think about the gift of time that our research participants and their care partners bring to those observational studies, knowing that they are contributing to the foundation of what will then be an interventional study. That's what everybody hopes for. I want to take this pill that will potentially change my disease. But if our scientists and clinicians don't know what changes to look for, then they can't really measure effectiveness of interventions. So just thinking about what gratitude we have for people who participate in observational studies.
Yeah, none of the important secondary work can be done without all of the effort that goes into the development of the procedures, the development of the technology, the development, the linking of the biological factors to the changes that we see in the brain, as well as understanding even how to look for these different types of therapeutic effects. Simple things like knowing that if somebody has a high level of education, their relationship between their brain and thinking abilities is different than somebody who has a different level of education. And if we don't know that, if we didn't learn that from these observational studies, then we might not be able to look at the imaging data in an appropriate way when we're testing new interventions.
And I think that point that you just brought up, Dr. Slot, speaks very much to the international connections that the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging has, in that I think in the United States, there is a lot of access to education that might not be available in other countries around the world. And so thinking about how can we have global efforts to understand and measure cognitive change?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very important point. I should have mentioned earlier that we have a great network of research within MGH, but the networks do not end there. These studies that really are highly impactful are multi-site, multi-center, typically require research participation from individuals throughout many different locations, including international locations, because to really make these links, it's required that large samples participate in these studies, and it's typically not possible to get the sort of participation at one site alone. And so a number of these studies are performed through consortia that are, again, within multiple sites within the United States, or maybe multiple sites internationally. A lot of effort, going back to the requirements of a study like that, a lot of effort needs to be put towards the ability to actually do those studies so that you know that the data that you're getting from a site in the United States is comparable to the data that you're getting from a site outside of the United States. Otherwise, it's difficult to combine the data across those sites.
And I think just speaks to our human commonalities around the globe. And it's incredibly moving to me to think about a global community committed to healing for Alzheimer's and related dementias. Dr. Salat, thank you so much. That was so much fun to really be together in that experience of talking about this larger connection for families to research, even global efforts, and to really look at these very complex images and to think about how they can be meaningful to each individual person. So thank you for taking the time and sharing your gift of expertise with us today.
Thanks for having me. I think as discussed, the clinic is doing great work, and the utilization and these technologies, and really bringing the participation that the patients give is really important for us to continue developing these procedures and understanding these conditions.
I want to thank everyone who contributed to today's session. The Martino Center is made up of an amazing group of professionals, scientists, healthcare providers, and amazing staff. The MGH FTD unit is a clinical research program dedicated to providing the highest quality of care while working tirelessly towards a cure. Our webinar series and educational resources are available online for free anytime. Check out our YouTube channel. Go to our webpage at ftdboston.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, stay safe and be well.